Well, it's really, really lovely that we've had such interest in this webinar. And I think that's a real affirmation for all of us gathered here today to bring this webinar to you. And we're really, really delighted to welcome you all and to see you, most of you. So just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm Louisa Lockwood, editor of Preach magazine. The webinar grew out of an issue of Preach magazine, which was called Grief and Lament. Here's the cover. Some of you will have seen it. If you sign up on our website, we can send you out a hard copy of that at the end of this webinar. We're co-managing the webinar with Loss and Hope. And there are two of our speakers here today from Loss and Hope. Katy Tutt will give us a wave. Thanks, Katy. And Rev Cassius Francis is going to give us a wave. Thank you. And they both work with Loss and Hope. You'll have seen the Loss and Hope website at the start of the webinar on the sign. And then our third speaker today is Judith Brashaw. There she is. And Judith is speaking from Oundle Baptist Church, where they've been are still on a journey of becoming a bereavement-friendly church. And I know that many of you here will have lots of questions for Judith by the time we get to her session too. So I'd just like to hand you over to Cassius now. And well, just to remind the people who've just joined, thank you very much for joining. And just to say to you, if you can say hello in the chat, make sure you've got the chat on, and that's the place to pose any questions. We will also post links in the chat, and we'll put our emails in there if you want to contact us in that way as well. So if you don't get a question answered during the webinar, don't worry, we will get back to you in other ways. So I'm going to hand over to Cassius, who's going to open in prayer and then go into his session. Thank you.
Thanks, Louisa. Let's pray. God of justice, firstly, we pray for our brothers and sisters in Ukraine, our brothers and sisters around the world who are involved in conflict, those experiencing grief, bereavement today. We pray for your comfort to be with each one. We pray that as we focus in for this hour on grief and lament, that you will help us to make the best of our time together, so that when we've left, we are able to say that it was good to be here. Lead us by your Spirit, Lord, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So, good afternoon. As Louisa said, my name's Cassius. I'm a minister with the Wesleyan Holiness Church, and I also work for Loss and Hope. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I have to say that it is a struggle thinking about speaking for 8 minutes as a Wesleyan minister, but I've been reassured by Louisa that she won't cut me off. I'm hoping that that's still the case. We'll see. We'll see how we get on. I'm going to talk to you about preaching and leading about grief and lament. And I'm going to focus particularly on lessons that we can learn from Job's friends, Job's 3 friends, particularly looking at Job chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. So if you're wanting to follow in scripture, then that's where we're going to be focusing on. We're told in Job chapter 1 that firstly, he was a blameless and upright man. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned thousands of sheep, thousands of camels, hundreds of oxen and donkeys. It's estimated that Job's wealth today would have meant that he was a multimillionaire. And then one day, Job lost everything. His animals were stolen. Those who worked for him were killed by fire and burned up. His sons and daughters died in a disaster that struck their home. After all of that, Job's own health deteriorated. He had sores on the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Today, I'm not going to spend time looking at why all of this happened to Job. I want to focus particularly on what we can learn from his three friends to benefit our preaching and leading. So firstly, let me read those verses, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, Job chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. Now, when Job's three friends heard all these troubles had come upon him, each of them set out from his home, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They met together to go and console and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air on their heads. They sat on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Firstly,
I don't know, but I think I've got some words.
These verses, I'd like to encourage us as preachers and leaders to be prepared to move from where we are when we are trying to support those who may be experiencing grief. It says that now when Job's three friends heard all of these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from their homes. In our preaching, is there space to demonstrate where we might have moved or shifted from our previous understanding of faith? The book of Job provides a profound statement on the subject of theodicy, the justice of God in the light of human suffering. The book perhaps challenges us to reflect on some of the assumptions that we may make about our faith. For example, when it says in Job chapter 1 and verse 1 that he was blameless and upright and one who feared God and turned away from evil, our assumption might be that Job should expect God's blessing and protection. However, as the story unfolds, there is neither of those things. We're forced, along with Job's friends, to theologize as to why he is experiencing such suffering. In our preaching, do we reflect how we've been challenged to move or think differently about our faith as a result of suffering and experience some trauma or even bereavement? Indeed, isn't the incarnation, God becoming flesh in the shape of his son, Jesus Christ, all about experiencing life in all of its difficulty? I believe the best leadership comes from empathy. If we haven't experienced a problem, we should at least listen as much as possible. Secondly, be willing to show grief. The word tells us that Job's friends raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air on their heads. We all grieve in different ways, but I think we can learn from Job's friends that it's okay to show that we're upset in our preaching and leading. The fact that they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads was a visible sign of mourning for their community. Sometimes in our Western culture, we can be afraid to show grief, and if we're not careful, we can send those same messages in our churches. Can I encourage you that in our preaching and leading, it's important to model to our congregations that sometimes it's okay to not be okay? Shouldn't our churches be places that are safe for us to express grief if we have people who are feeling vulnerable. There's also an important reflection for us in terms of the place of lament. Although the friends that come to console him end up theologizing about the reason for Job's suffering, some of Job's words themselves are lament in chapter 3. However, I would caution against theologizing over someone's situation and try not to correct a bereaved person or try to heal their pain. Healing comes from journeying through the dark valley to the light at the end. Augustine once said, it's better, though, that the human heart should feel grief and be cured of it than not feeling any grief to become inhuman. In our preaching and leading, is there a place for lament? As a side note, I'm reminded as a Wesleyan minister of the importance of music and song in this time of Lent. The eerie and somber tones of the spiritual song, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" I won't attempt to sing it over Zoom for you this afternoon, but there is a sense that it is important to reflect the whole of the Easter story. In her book, Faith Questions on Bereavement, the founder of Loss and Hope, Yvonne Richmond Tulloch, talks about the triumphalism that we can get used to in our churches, an emphasis on things going right for Christians, on the victory of Easter Sunday over the pain of Good Friday, when the whole of the Easter story is perhaps important for us to reflect in the gospel message. So firstly, thinking about where we have moved. Secondly, reflecting on the fact that it is maybe important for us to show our own sense of grief in our leadership and preaching. And third, thinking about listening. They sat on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw his suffering was great. The Hebrew word for 7 is shiva. Shiva is also the word used to describe a Jewish funeral ritual where the community stay with the bereaved individual for 7 days after the funeral to take care of the bereaved individual. I'm not suggesting that we should adopt this tradition, but the principle demonstrated by Job's friend of just sitting and being present is an important one for us to take note of. Sometimes bereaved people will comment to us on seeing others crossing the road or avoiding them at church because they just don't know what to say to the bereaved person. Can I encourage you that at a time of bereavement, your listening is more important than your speaking. So you don't have to worry so much about saying the right thing. And I do wonder if we would be more effective as preachers and leaders if we invested more time in listening than speaking. Just to conclude, some of the scriptures and comments that I would say should come with a health warning for those of us who are preaching and leading to bereaved people in our congregations. Romans 8 and verse 28, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose, is a wonderful scripture of victory. But thinking about how that sounds to a bereaved person, even with the best will of wanting to bring comfort, may not be the appropriate one to use. God knows best. He's in control. Life is God's gift. People shouldn't end it. Suicide is the unpardonable sin. So let's be balanced in our preaching and leading, bearing in mind the lessons that we can learn from Job's 3 friends. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Cassius. That's really, really full of depth and wisdom, and truly lived experience came through very, very clearly. Thank you very much. Did anybody have any questions for Cassius? Lots of amens and thank you. Excellent, thank you. I think the point you ended up on about, you know, the key to listening more than speaking should give us all a lot of confidence, because we can all listen, and that's the starting point. So if anybody's wondering about how to come closer to others in grief, that should be a key part of it. There are also well, churches are places that, I think we'll get onto this a little bit later as well. Churches are places where we should be able to come and bring all our troubles and woes, but sometimes people feel they have to put a stiff upper lip when they come to church and be on their best behaviour. But I've certainly shed many, many tears in my church and been grateful for the opportunity to do that. So I know that the Lord does a lot of healing there when tears are shed, and that's a real message for preachers as well. We can show our broken hearts when we preach.
Yeah, and I appreciate that's a real challenge when you are wanting to lead a congregation. But I think one of the things that I've learned and had to grow in as a minister is recognizing that the vulnerability also enables other people in the congregation to express more honestly how they may be feeling, and I appreciate that there are challenges around that. I did see a couple of comments come up around the comment that I made about suicide. Again, and this is something that I learned because I wasn't familiar with, doing some training, attended some training some years ago with Yvonne at Cliff College, and there was a conversation that some of the trainees had experienced real challenges supporting families where there was a death by suicide, even with some churches sadly refusing to bury that deceased person. It wasn't something that was familiar to me, but there can be particular theological perspectives that, you know, are really and you know, that's probably at the extreme example, but you know, really don't help the grieving family at a time when they are already torn apart by the loss of a loved one, not to be able to find support in our churches.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Just to clarify there, you were quoting something that had been quoted at you and has been used in the past, hasn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
Describe suicide as the unpardonable sin.
Yeah.
That is something that's not held today. Can be sort of a backlog in people's theology and thinking, but churches' responses to that is very, very different today, isn't it? Generally.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the principle is, and the points of those last few comments are really just taking time to think, you know, how this is going to sound to the bereaved family, the bereaved individual, and whether, you know, whether we allow space to be changed ourselves, in terms of the positions that we may have adopted. You know, the way that I thought when I was first trained as a minister in supporting families, was great in being able to deliver the funerals. But I realized quite quickly as a minister that actually that wasn't everything that was most supportive in supporting a bereaved family, that it was about journeying beyond the funeral, and in the the months and years to come that I needed to learn and understand more about. And so yes,
yeah, thank you. That's the value of a longer ministry, isn't it? And the wisdom we accrue as we grow with people and keep our eyes open and listen to their needs. Thank you very much indeed. That was illuminating and very helpful. And I'd like to invite our next speaker, Katy Tutt, also from Loss and Hope. And Katy's going to briefly introduce herself and then launch into her session.
Thank you very much, Louisa. I have some slides to share as I speak, so you can look at some of the things that I'd like to tell you about as well. Just get that screen sharing going. There, Louisa, can you confirm that that's okay? Yeah, good, okay. So thank you very much. It's really good to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. My name is Katy Tutt and I am Project Manager for Loss and Hope, which is a joint project of the Church of England Life Events Department, At a Loss, Care for the Family and Hope Together. And the aim of the project is to equip churches in bereavement support via a series of resources and courses delivered alongside our partners. Bereavement support is not new to us. It's something we're all used to doing to a greater or lesser extent, depending on our role within our churches. But with so many people having been bereaved, particularly in the last 2 years, and as somebody just said in the chat, the restrictions on all our lives, not being able to hug people, it's all affected our ability to do the things we would normally do to process a death. And bereavement charities are really worried. We're anticipating huge numbers of people who will have put their grief on hold during the pandemic. And as the restrictions ease, many people will be keen to get on with their lives, to do the things they've missed out on, to put the past year or two behind them. But for many of those people who've been bereaved, the pandemic has made us put a lid on our grief, and getting back out into our communities and our churches will very likely take the lid off that grief and has the potential to leave us really struggling and left behind. So what can we do to prepare? What resources are available to us? Bereavement support doesn't need to be complicated. It doesn't need to be expensive. At a Loss is one of the members of the Loss and Hope project, and the website atalos.org is a national signposting hub containing over 1,400 services, searchable by local area and by type of bereavement. And there's also a live counsellor service called Grief Chat, as well as articles and other resources. So a really simple thing that can be done is to link to that website from our church websites, put up a poster on our notice boards or at the back of our churches, and maybe have some signposting cards available. You can see a little photo of those there. And this shows bereaved people that our church is a place where grief is supported. Church of England research done in January 2021 showed that 9 out of 10 people have experienced the death of someone they know well in the last 5 years. That's a huge number. In every context, from school gate to youth group to Sunday worship to the food bank, you'll meet those who are bereaved. How best can churches offer pastoral care that reflects the love of Jesus? Here are a couple of quotes from respondents to the research questions. It would be amazing if there were support groups and more help when dealing with grief. I also feel this would encourage more people to join their church later down the line. We don't forget those who help us at our darkest times. I have to admit I'm not very religious. I do like the idea, though, of the church working in local communities to encourage people in being able to share and cope with grief. So people are asking for our help. Everybody in our church can and should be involved, not just the clergy, not just the pastoral support team, the trained bereavement counsellor. A great starting point is to book a place on the Care for the Family Bereavement Care Awareness webinar. And this is a really great introduction to what individuals can do to get alongside those who are grieving. And it can be booked by anyone, all of our church members. You can book as an individual, as a group from your church, or have one of Care for the Family's facilitators deliver the training to your whole church. It's available online at the moment, but it will return to in person as well. And that can help us avoid some of those slip-ups that we make when we're well-meaning, but we're not quite sure what to say. So what can we do as churches? It doesn't have to be complicated. What we're doing already can be tweaked a little bit to be more inclusive to those who've been bereaved, as much for our existing congregations as new ones. Asking a family if they'd like a departed loved one remembered in the prayers at a baptism or a wedding, for example. We really have to consider how our services can be welcoming to those who are grieving, especially at those key times in our church calendar and in the secular one too. In addition to that, can we hold a special service for those who need a quiet space at these times? And our website has suites of resources available now for those churches that would like to support their congregations and communities in their remembering. We have liturgy, prayer space ideas, books, worship songs and hymns. All of these things work well online if we're doing services online as well as in our churches. Cassius mentioned earlier, here we go, some of the resources, the liturgies that we have: Mother's Day runaways, services for All Souls, liturgies for Blue Christmas and the Longest Night, services for remembering around baby loss as well. Cassius mentioned earlier Bereavement-Friendly Church. What is a bereavement-friendly church? We have developed this definition. A church or group of churches where the impact of bereavement and the journey of grief are understood and alleviated, so that those who are grieving the death of someone in their life are helped to navigate the issues they face and come to a place of meaning and hope. I know Judith is going to talk a bit more about this later on, but if you'd like to know more after you've heard what she's going to say, you can pop over to the Loss and Hope website and book onto one of our webinars, where you will get lots of practical ideas on bereavement support, including support for you in reviewing your existing activities for how they might impact on those who've been bereaved. Another thing that you can do is run the Bereavement Journey. Again, Judith will talk about this and their experiences at Oundle, but it's a 6-session series of films and facilitated discussion groups offering a safe space for people bereaved in any way and at any time to process their loss. It's now being run by over 110 churches across the country as a nationwide church response to the pandemic, and full training is available to enable you to run it online or in person. And when we've been bereaved, it's so common to find ourselves asking the big questions of life. And the final optional faith question session gives people the opportunity to ask them. And if you decide to run the Bereavement Journey, if you're running another bereavement support activity regularly, you can add it to the Atalos website so that bereaved people in your local area can find it. And Cassius was talking earlier on about visible signs of mourning. In recognition that grief is an ongoing process, Atalos have created these really beautiful remembering someone badges. Many bereaved people have told us they really wish there was some way of telling people that they're grieving or feeling particularly fragile, like when people used to wear mourning clothes for a fixed period of time or a black armband. And these are a visible sign of mourning. It can be worn on an anniversary, a birthday, a special day, or just when you're really struggling. And somebody who came to one of our webinars before thought that they'd buy some for their church and have them blessed at a special service and then offer them as a gift to somebody that their team might be visiting, maybe in that quieter time as a funeral. and they're available from the Atelos website shop. So here are some links to our websites and social media pages so that you can keep in touch with us and sign up to our newsletter. We won't bombard you with hundreds of emails. There's the occasional sort of seasonal email. So thank you very much for your time today. It's been lovely to share a little bit about our project and hopefully give you some ideas.
Wow, Katy, thank you so much. There's a huge amount of research and experience that's gone into getting your materials and thoughts in line, I think, over the last few years as you've worked with Loss and Hope, and that's just wonderful that we can benefit from that.
I really just kind of scratched the surface there. A real whistle-stop tour of things that are available, but do contact us and visit the website and let us know if there's more that you'd like to know. We could talk for days.
Yeah, definitely go on the website, everybody. I'd really recommend that. And with any questions, Katy's available to answer emails, so you can get in touch directly as well. I'd like to ask you a question, Katy,
Yeah.
Slightly putting you on the spot, but I was just I was just wondering what you would say, how much you've learned since working with Loss and Hope yourself, what the journey you've been on, and yeah, it's a big one.
Lots. I've learnt a huge amount. I didn't have any particular experience in bereavement support myself, other than, you know, having lost friends and family myself. But from a church point of view, I've really been able to implement things that I've learned through the job in my church. You know, I was thinking when I was talking a little bit earlier on about what we can do in our churches, and having somebody remembered in prayers at a baptism or a wedding, that's really, it can be really, really helpful for the family, because obviously, you know, that the grandma might not be there anymore, but she would have been, and she would have loved to have been at that occasion. So to have her remembered in the prayers is really meaningful. Also, I happen to be the person in my church who does the rota for the people who are going to do the readings. And I would never have thought of this before, but one person was due to do a reading, and it was the reading that was read at her mother's funeral. So I sent her a message and said, look, you're down to do this reading. Is it okay? Would you like me to get someone else to do it? And she actually liked, she was happy to do it. She wanted to do it. It was meaningful for her. But just to have had that thought process, is that going to be okay for her? Someone else was doing a reading, and it was particularly focused on death, and their husband had died not long before. So, you know, these things that we can just not occur to us. If we just shift our mindset a little bit, how is this going to sound? How is this going to feel? What can we do to make this a bit easier? We can't fix it. There's no fixing it, and trying to fix it is not appropriate. So we just have to try and put ourselves in other people's shoes as far as we can.
That's really, really good to hear. And again, that comes back to that pausing and listening. Yeah. And trying to tune in, not to what our agenda is, but to what other people's agendas, what might be on their mind and troubling them. Yeah. That comes back to the compassion and care we can learn to feel for each other. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That was really insightful. I don't know if anybody has got a specific question for Katy. The thing is that everyone will think of stuff afterwards and then want to talk to you. So
that's fine. Just send me an email. It's fine.
Yeah, that would be great. So I would like to invite. Thank you, Katy. Katy's put her email in the chat.
That was Joe has. Super Joe. Thanks.
Wonderful tech support has. So I'd like to invite Judith to begin her session. Hi, Judith.
Hi.
And to take us on the journey with you, Judith, of how we can consider becoming a bereavement-friendly church.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Judith Brashaw, and I'm a member of Oundle Baptist Church. I'm sure that, like me, you've had the experience of meeting a friend or neighbour who you know has recently been bereaved, and you've just not known what to say. And we felt this very acutely at our church when a young family suffered the death of their baby daughter just a few hours after she died. We felt helpless. We wanted to do better. We wanted to be equipped for the church family and those in our community to be better supported as they face any kind of loss, whether through illness, a terminal diagnosis, or any kind of bereavement. We wanted to create an environment where grief and lament could be expressed, as Cassius discussed, where we can learn to listen, where we can offer a framework and some suggestions, perhaps helpful tools that people can make use of if they wish to. Oundle Baptist Church has about 80 members, and we're a market town surrounded by about 12 satellite villages. That's the community that we serve. So how do we become a bereavement-friendly church? How do we become a bereavement-friendly town? We knew we needed help. We knew we needed to learn from other people and get their advice and ideas. So we contacted Yvonne, the founder of At a Loss, and she came to meet us. Our minister invited her, and he invited some other ministers to the meeting. We then organised and hosted a Bereavement Care Awareness Day, and we invited some local charities and all our local churches to join us for that day. That was the beginning, and it drew together a bereavement ministry team within our church. And then we thought, but what do we do now? So we looked around and we found there was a death cafe in Kettering. So on a wet February night, we joined 40 other people to talk about death in a working men's club. I couldn't believe that they were all there. That had been hosted by an independent celebrant working with a local vicar, a palliative care nurse, and a will writer. They weren't in it for the business they could get. They were in it because they'd seen the struggles people had talking about death and dying. We realised we needed to get that kind of network going in Oundle as well. So we collaborated with our local lawyers, the undertakers, the library, the doctor's surgery, our local volunteer group. We started building up resources, finding sources of information, buying books, endless books, finding the Church of England funeral website, finding the Care for the Family website, finding At a Loss, and so on. We realised we needed more training. I attended the bereavement ministry course at Cliff College, where I met Cassius and 30 others who were trying to do the same in their communities. Such an eye-opener to meet the range of people and learn from their experience. Then we decided to have a go. We organised our own Grave Talk Cafe. The materials and resources are on the COB website. We had some expert guests and we invited all our church family to join us. Such interesting discussions and conversations. And we spoke to the local library and offered to run it there. They were keen. And we also heard about the bereavement awareness course. Sorry, we heard about the Bereavement Journey course and decided to run it ourselves. We launched with great enthusiasm and then it was locked down. So on week 4, we were shut down from that, but then we heard that the Bereavement Journey had gone online. So some of our team volunteered on that and we learned so much participating on it, seeing the material in action, seeing the help it gave to those who came along, the difference it made as it helped them to move forward in their loss. We encouraged people that we knew to attend it and they've all benefited from it. During lockdown, our minister asked the team to lead an online Sunday service. The theme he gave us, what happens when I die? Thanks, Martin. So we put together the service, but we were able to include in it bereavement resources, and we were able to ask people who'd done the Bereavement Journey course online to share their experience. So it just was, more people became aware of what was out there for them. As restrictions eased last June, we don't have a church building, but we borrowed the local Anglican church to offer a service of reflection and remembrance. People found that very helpful to consider all the losses that they'd had throughout the pandemic, not just actual deaths, but so many losses that people have suffered. And as we said, people hadn't been able to be at the bedside of those their loved ones who were dying, or the graveside. So this provided an opportunity for them to reflect. That's something we think we'll do every year now. We found that people have begun to approach us for information and advice and guidance as they're supporting friends and family. And we're so privileged to be able to have that opportunity. Our local library agreed for us to host some Grave Talk cafes there, which we did in the autumn, and they used their networks to spread the word more widely. And Oundle Library has also agreed to join the Death Positive Library movement. You may not have heard about that. I'll ask Joe to put a link up later to that. But we're going to donate 20 books to of our favourite books to the local library to strengthen their collection on death, dying and loss. More of our team attended the Bereavement-Friendly church training online, and some of our trustees have attended as well. This really strengthens the work within the church family. It's very much a collaborative and community thing. Our team can't do it on our own. We're just a few people. And as time goes on, we all suffer our own losses and struggles and illnesses too. And we need to step back and take a break. So we share the load between us. We just create a space where people can talk about their loss. They can talk about what's happening to them, and we can accept them as they do so. We can't fix them. And some people will need specialist help. Some people will need extra support and expertise that we cannot offer. However, each one of us can listen as somebody shares their journey of their own loss. And for some people, that is enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really interesting and really helpful. I'd just like to ask about the, because it's encouraging, I think you said you've got 80 members. That's about the average size perhaps of a church. So smaller churches and larger churches will be able to find their own way through this too. And you don't have a church building. So that's also encouragement for everybody who's got a hosting space ready and available. And how many in your small team, Judith, were the initial people you managed to get interested?
We've got 6 in our small team. And we've got, then we'll call in other people to help us with particular events. And we'll, 1 or 2 people might try and work on developing a project, and then we'll go along with them on it.
Oh, interesting. So 6 is quite a good sized team, really.
Mm.
And what are the skills? What would you say were the key skills in that team that you bring?
One of them is the minister. So that's great. We do have somebody who's a qualified counsellor. We have somebody who has worked as a nurse. We've all, they're all listening. They can chip in and tell us. I think we've got the real skills are people with a heart of compassion, but also who've experienced loss and bereavement themselves and have some understanding of it. But who know that it is very much a gentle walking alongside. It's not a fixing, and that we've got a lot to learn. And everybody, we might put something on and think, oh, great, this is going to be really good. This will help so many people. Why aren't they coming?
Yes. Yeah.
But it just might not be their time. It's not helpful to them. Some people are very private.
Yes. Yeah.
There is no one size fits all.
We have to persevere. Keep the invitation.
I think I'll email them and ask.
Keep the invitation there for people. And I guess also another observation is that something that you may have learnt with one person can be quite different with another person, and they have different preferences, and that may change as we travel along our journey of grief as well. Absolutely. I think that's right. That's interesting. There was a question, a practical question, which is probably for Katy as well, which is how to advertise courses locally. Where are good places to tell people about the courses?
Yeah, I've put a few notes into the chat, but we find that lots of churches advertise their courses on local Facebook groups. So the group for your town or your village, or advertise through other churches as well. Maybe they'd like to join in with you. Maybe they'd like to provide some helpers, some volunteers. Advertise it, letting your GP surgery know, so that if they have somebody who comes to see them that they think might benefit, they can sort of refer you on. We've also had some people getting to know their local social prescribers, which are a relatively new thing. But we've had several churches say to us that the social prescribers have almost prescribed bereavement, going on the bereavement journey. Obviously there's the usual posters and that kind of thing. Let your funeral directors know, so that they can give a little card to somebody to say, maybe you'd like this, not now, but in the future. At the Atalos website, people can search there for things in their area. So if you're doing something, tell us about it and we'll advertise it for you. And on our social media as well, we do that as soon as we know someone's running a course, we advertise it for them. And obviously on your own website and social media as well.
And I think sometimes the local newspapers, we forget print sometimes these days,
Yeah.
but they can be looking for stories as well about what's going on, and particularly in the local church communities. And the churches together, newsletters that go out around areas, that's another place as well.
Oh yeah, hospital chaplains, somebody's just said as well. They'll have connections too.
Lots of ideas and thoughts. Yeah, that's great.
And and if you can get things into the local library and those kind of things, and we haven't succeeded in this yet, but also letting people know in local care homes and places like that.
There's a question here as well for everybody. Any tips on how to talk to children and teenagers about bereavement?
Atalos does have a resource and a training course called Listening People, which is great for people who are working with children and young people who have been bereaved. It's not just about death, it's about loss generally. So if you go to the Atalos website, you can have a look there. There's also resources there for supporting children and young people specifically.
There are some great books for children about bereavement, some of which I think are on the book list that we're going to publish, aren't there? Sorry, I'm just looking at one of the questions. So there are some excellent books for children. And Cassius, a training day I came to with you, you showed a really good video for children that actually showed what would happen at a funeral, so that people could be prepared before they went. You had some other videos for children particularly, didn't you?
Yeah, I'll try and get that link actually and post it in the chat. There were several videos. I think the one that you're referring to was produced, might have been in Northern Ireland or Scotland perhaps, but I'll find the link. So there are a lot of good resources out there, as Katie and Judith have said. There are also specific training avenues that you can access, organisations that will work specifically with children and young people as well, where you can get further advice and information. Edward's Trust is one that I'm familiar with in Birmingham, but there are other charities and organisations working around the country.
And as I understand it, this is not something I'm very experienced with, but except personally, in having been bereaved as a child, but is that people should be honest, as truthful, as age appropriate as possible, that if somebody has died, they are not coming back, and those kind of things. And to admit that somebody's poorly, if somebody is poorly and in hospital and might die, not to just say they will get better. It's those kind of things, isn't it? Learning to be truthful in a way that's helpful.
in a compassionate way, thinking of how that person's receiving that information. Absolutely. There's a question from James in the chat, you might have noticed. How does this apply for people who take funerals? In my experience, there often seems to be a pressure to make it a celebration of life rather than a place where grief is expressed. Cassius, you'd like to start perhaps?
Yeah, really good question. I think there has been a tendency for us to move towards this idea as a funeral as a celebration of life. And yeah, I suppose reflecting on my own tradition and background, you know, recognizing the importance of that place to grieve as well is really critical as part of the grief process. But you know, I appreciate that everybody is in different places when it comes to a funeral as well. But yeah, I think in terms of the question, yes, we have recognized, and again, it's something that Yvonne refers to in her book around kind of faith questions, that there can be this moving towards, and it relates to what I was saying about this attitude towards Easter. We want to rush towards, you know, the resurrection and the celebration, but actually that reflecting on the pain of Good Friday, you know, the death of Christ is a critical part of that process, and maybe that might be a helpful way for us to reflect. But I suppose what I've learned as a minister is really to spend time trying to really key into where the family are, rather than starting, or the individual that's bereaved, rather than starting in my place as a minister and you know, what I may want to say or how I may want to lead. But yeah, you know, for some families they may just want to celebrate, and that is their expression.
Thank you for that. I think there was
a question about DBS. Shall I just answer that? We just everyone involved in our bereavement ministry has had a current DBS check with our church.
Yeah, I think that's really sensible. For at least for a period of time, bereaved people are vulnerable, and for families of those who are being supported, it's reassuring to know that the people doing the supporting have had a DBS check. We have found that if you make the application for the DBS quite broad, so say that you're working in the volunteer adult workforce in the church or pastoral support or something, then that gets through. Whereas if you say bereavement support, it's a bit too narrow. It's not one of the criteria that is required, or will just get sort of ticked off straight away. So if you make it quite broad, that tends to be okay.
That's helpful. There's a comment about a Renew Wellbeing space where people can, it's okay for people not to be okay. Is that something you're familiar with?
Yes, I have heard a little bit about those. They seem to be absolutely wonderful. And anything that you are doing at your church where people come, you're likely to come across bereaved people. And if you can then signpost on to further support, you know, a coffee morning, a walk, and a walking group, whatever you're doing, be aware that, well, like I said earlier on, 9 out of 10 people will have been bereaved in the last 5 years. So anyone and everyone might need follow-up support. So if you've got a Renew Wellbeing space, do signpost on to bereavement support as well.
And somebody referred to the fact that they'd been widowed but not felt they'd had any follow-up in the chat, and I just really encourage them to either find a local bereavement journey course near where they live or do the June course that Loss and Hope will be running, because it is extremely helpful, and you will meet others who've suffered a similar bereavement, and that in itself can be very helpful.
It's never too late to get good bereavement support.
And don't wait 45 years like I did. Do it sooner.
There's another person sharing a comment, Veronica, said, we had the experience of the unexpected death of our minister in 2018, who'd pastored us for 30 years, church plant. Hard for us all as a church, but by God's grace, we supported one another in love. Thank you for sharing that. Claire Masters has said your local hospice should also be able to signpost you to resources and support for children. Just reading these out in case others haven't spotted them. Somebody's in the process of opening a Renew Wellbeing space. Signposts to bereavement services will be incredibly valuable. Winston's Wish in Gloucestershire. A question for Cassius. How do you conduct a funeral for someone who had no faith in Jesus while remaining true to the scriptures? As in, as a minister remaining true to the scriptures.
How do I? Yeah, I read a really interesting article last week about preaching the gospel at funerals, and someone sharing their wisdom. I think what I try to do, firstly, it's not my place to make any judgment on the deceased individual. So I try and draw as much as I can from the life of the person, by what the family are saying, by the eulogy, and encourage them, by the grace of God, to recognize that the fact, particularly that they have asked for a Christian funeral, to reflect on the place of God, within everything that is said, and to do that on a personal, on an individual basis each time. So it isn't, it's not as if there is a standard sermon for me that can be preached at each funeral. It's connecting with that individual, but it's not my place to make a judgment about that deceased individual. So I feel always as if I'm able to to hold my integrity, knowing that that it is God that makes that judgment, and not me. My place, I start from the place of bringing comfort and hope to the bereaved family. That's always my starting point when I'm conducting a funeral.
I think those are very, very wise words, and a lot to think about there too. So really, we don't have time for any more questions. it is the end of the webinar, and we'd just like to say thank you so much to everybody for joining us. We really, really value all of you as participants, and your questions and comments have been really helpful and driven the webinar along as well and given us food for thought. So we will send you the link to the webinar so you can listen to it again, and you can contact any of us as well, as I said before. But we're going to the four of us will stay here, but we'll say goodbye to all of you. So blessings on you, and may you go well this week.